It was a cold, silent night in January, and the fog was heavier than I had ever seen. I still remember every detail of what happened that night. I was working the night shift at a factory on the edge of a small Oregon town. My friend Jason, a quiet and hardworking guy, had been walking home after our shifts for months. His route took him through Blackwood Lane, a long, narrow road surrounded by thick woods on one side and an old graveyard on the other. People in town often whispered about Blackwood Lane. Some said they saw strange shadows moving between the trees at night. Others claimed to hear voices calling their names. Jason, however, never believed in such things. "Just stories to scare kids," he used to say. That night, our shift ended at 3:15 a.m. and Jason left a few minutes before me. I stayed back to finish some paperwork, and by the time I got outside, the fog was so thick that it felt like I was walking into a wall. I remember the air, it was damp and carried a strange metallic smell, almost like rust. Around 3:45 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was Jason. I answered expecting him to ask for a ride or maybe tell me something funny about his walk home. But when I picked up, all I heard was heavy breathing and faint static. "Jason?" I called out, but he didn't respond. Then the call ended abruptly. I tried calling him back, but there was no answer. At first I thought maybe his phone had died or he'd accidentally called me. But something about the way he was breathing, it didn't feel right. I brushed it off and went home. The next morning, Jason didn't show up for work. This wasn't like him. Jason was always on time. Concerned, I went to his apartment later that evening. His roommate answered the door looking worried. "Jason never came home last night?" he said. My stomach dropped. 3 days later, I got a call from the local hospital. Jason had been found unconscious on the side of Blackwood Lane. He was alive, but barely responsive. I rushed to see him. When I walked into his room, I hardly recognized him. Jason looked pale, almost gray, like all the life had been drained out of him. His eyes were bloodshot, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. It took a while for him to tell me what had happened. At first, he just stared at the ceiling, refusing to talk. Finally, in a shaky voice, he began to explain. As he walked down Blackwood Lane that night, he said the fog felt strange. It wasn't normal fog, it swirled unnaturally, almost like it was alive. The air smelled metallic like rust or blood, and it made him feel sick to his stomach. Jason told me he started to feel like he wasn't alone. He could hear faint rustling in the woods like footsteps, but when he turned to look, the forest was empty. The road, which usually took about 10 minutes to walk, felt endless that night. It was as if the more he walked, the farther away his destination became. Then he saw it. A figure standing on the edge of the woods, just barely visible through the fog. The figure was tall and thin, with glowing red eyes that pierced through the mist. Jason froze. He said he couldn't move, couldn't look away. The figure didn't move either. It just stood there staring at him. Jason blinked and suddenly the figure was gone. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. He started walking faster, but his legs felt heavy like something was pulling him back. That's when he heard it. A soft laugh, low and hollow, coming from the woods. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, echoing around him. Jason tried to run, but before he could take more than a few steps, he felt a sharp, cold pain at the back of his head, like he'd been hit with a rock or a hammer. The world spun, and Jason fell to the ground. He said he could hear the laughter growing louder and felt something cold touch his face before everything went black. When he woke up, he was lying on the side of the road. A truck driver had spotted him and called for help. Jason was alive, but whatever happened to him that night left a mark. He hasn't been the same since. Jason refuses to go near Blackwood Lane even during the day. He gets nervous anytime he sees fog, and sometimes he wakes up in the middle of the night saying he can hear the same laughter from his dreams. I still think about Jason's story, especially on cold, foggy nights. I've heard many strange stories about Blackwood Lane, but his is the one that sticks with me the most. The question that haunts me is this: what would have happened if Jason hadn't woken up on the side of that road? Would he have made it home at all?